Praise be to Jesus Christ and welcome to Catholic Forum. I'm your guest host, Alan Dunst. We want to thank you for being with us. We hope that our little conversation here in West Michigan finds you wherever you may be and draws you a little bit closer to Jesus Christ through His one holy Catholic and Apostolic Church. On today's show, we're going to tackle a tough topic, I think. Understanding the characteristics of God can be challenging for believers and doubters alike, and we're going to be tackling the aspect of God known as omnipotence. And when we say we believe in God the Father Almighty, we're stating that we're placing a trust in God's omnipotence as being all-powerful. And yet, if we look around, we see sin and suffering that kind of belies that power, and so that can be a source of confusion for many. And so we're going to kind of tackle that and what we might call a war of the wills between the belief that God's will cannot be thwarted because He is all-powerful and our own personal free will being at work. So to help us tackle this relatively difficult topic, we've got someone who I'm sure will do a great job for us, Dr. Dennis Marshall.
Hi, Alan.
Professor of Theology at Aquinas College here in Grand Rapids, Michigan. So we're very grateful to have you to help us through this, because this is a tough topic.
Happy to be here.
Well, I'm glad you're looking up for the challenge.
Try to do what I can.
So one of the typical challenges given by atheists in particular is that a loving God would not allow suffering or injustice, and hence the fact that there is suffering or injustice leads them to believe that either there is no God, or He is not loving, or He's not capable, or He's not all-powerful and able to stop it.
Right.
So how do we take on that challenge?
Yeah, that's David Hume's famous argument, by the way, and I don't find it particularly convincing, because if he makes the claim in his argument that if God is good, then He must stop evil. In other words, because anybody who's a good person is morally obligated to stop evil. And so when my students raise this particular problem within the classroom, I ask them if their parents ever let them do anything that ended them getting them a scraped knee or something like that, say riding a bike and so on and so forth. And well, yeah, they, when they first let me ride the bike and I wobbled down the street under my own power and crashed and burned at the end of it. Is it evil to get your knee scraped and to crash and be hurt like that? Yes. Were your parents not good because they allowed that to happen? Well, no, they couldn't say that, because so now they have this example, this concrete example of where a good person is not morally obligated to stop every incidence of evil. So that argument, it seems to me, falls flat on its face, just simply based on that experience. Mm-hmm. Now, that it raises all kinds of questions about God's omnipotence, of course, and we would need to think what omnipotence means, because I'm not so confident in an atheist. What he means by omnipotence is going to be the same thing that, say, a Catholic believer means by omnipotence. So what is it precisely we mean by omnipotence when we speak of God being the Father Almighty? If you notice within the Creed, we mention first fatherhood. Mm-hmm. And we recognize that, and in that language of fatherhood, we understand that God is love. And so when we begin to try to comprehend what it is His power may be, it's related to His fatherhood, so it's the power of love. So omnipotence then would not be the ability to do whatever God wants, which would be that kind of arbitrary way that some people see it. Because if God could do whatever he wants, then we would be caught up in all kinds of nonsense, like God could create a rock that he could not lift. You see what I'm saying? And this is just utter absurdity, and there's no way that we could legitimately think about that. But when we think about God and his omnipotence as being one of love, then God cannot act contrary. You know, his power is exercised in a way that's consonant with his love and not contrary to his nature.
Yeah, and since you mentioned that, I want to actually quote the Catechism here, because I love this paragraph I ran across. It's paragraph 271, and I want to encourage our viewers and listeners to check out the Catechism, paragraphs 268 through 274 for a little bit more on what the Catechism has to say about God's omnipotence. But it says, in God, power, essence, will, intellect, wisdom, and justice are all identical. Nothing, therefore, can be in God's power which would not also be in his just will or his wise intellect.
Right.
So like you were saying, it's all of a piece.
Right. It is all of a piece. And omnipotence has a further reference to God's providential governance of the world. See, nothing exists outside of God, and nothing takes place without it happening within the context of God's will. Well, somebody might argue based on that, then God wills evil, but that is in fact not the case. He does allow it. This is a language that we theologians and theists use. He does allow evil, but he is not the cause of evil. So when I do something wrong and do something harmful, then it's actually me who is doing it, and it's not God who is doing it or causing me actually to do that. So in this way, then, it might seem that, well, if I can act contrary to God's will and I can introduce evil into the world, then I can thwart God's will and I can be more powerful than God. Well, that's not true, because God providentially governs the world. He creates a world in which it's possible for creatures like you and I to introduce evil into the world. But if we do introduce evil into the world, we do not become more powerful than God and destroy the goodness within which things were made, nor do we impede the ultimate end that God is going to bring about in his intention with creation. So God is more powerful than evil in the fact that, as St. Augustine says, he can bring good out of it. So the evil that you and I do, he weaves into the fabric of his providence in such a way as at the end of history, right, it all fits and harmonizes together in such a way that what is accomplished according to God's will.
Yeah, and in a sense, in the nature of the Bible, it's history in some sense, and that kind of gives people the sense that God at some point goes, "Oh crap," you've been here what, a day? You're already going after the fruit,
right?
And at the same time, you wonder, well, okay, you didn't see that coming, and so they kind of almost paint God into that comical way,
right,
as opposed to when you talk about the person who looks at it and says, "Oh, happy fault," and realize that from that, there came a Redeemer, and so God, in that evil and in that journey, in that redemption, taught us about himself. And that's something that a God that does mind control and that right, you would never know him as Father, really. Right. You know him as boss, as chief, as ruler, as in some religions do. Right? We know that they don't recognize God as Father, as trying to nurture a relationship, and instead everything is preordained, and so right, if you did it, that's because you were supposed to do it. Right. And as opposed to looking at God as inviting us to participate in his life and in his plan, and maybe it says we're told that he has good deeds for us to do. And it's just a matter of us being willing to do them.
Right.
It doesn't mean basically goodwill is deeds to do and get going.
Right, right.
Yeah.
And this ties back in when we were talking about, in our discussion about conscience, that once I arrive at a judgment to do the good or to not do the good, then God cannot change my mind on that. He will not force me. So in a certain sense, you might say that his omnipotence stops at his willingness to allow us to be free creatures, to exercise our own freedom in such a way that we could either arrive at beatitude or not. And it's not so much that he couldn't step in and force us to, by his power, to do what he wanted, but the fact of the matter is that he didn't create us for that. He didn't. He didn't create us to simply be a slave to him in that sense. We're free collaborators with God, and he is a free collaborator with us in bringing about the good that he intends through our work and through our cooperation with him.
Right. And some people see a conflict in terms of how free is our will in the light of God says, what I've set forth to do, I will do, and that kind of thing. What would you say to that kind of argument? What is free will? What is free will telling us? The fact that we have free will and a God that allows us to exercise it. What is that telling us about God and our relationship with him?
Well, I think the first thing that it says that, at least from my standpoint, that God is willing to take risks in which his creatures can choose to go against what he considers to be best for them. And in that sense, then we're truly free, and we're not robots, and we're not pawns on the board of creation by which God simply moves us around willy-nilly without our participation or cooperation with him. So we are free in that sense. Now, you raise a further interesting point when you talk about how free is our will with respect to, say, grace and with respect to sin. And because of original sin, our freedom is impeded. So we don't always accomplish the good we set out to do, as St. Paul says. And because of that, we need divine help. But God's grace, when he pours forth his grace upon us to help us to achieve the good that we should do, he's not overcoming my freedom. Under the idea that grace perfects nature, right? My freedom by his gift is made to be perfected in choosing his good. And since original sin wounds me and prohibits me from doing that, I need a little bit of divine help with that regard to strengthen the will in order to achieve the good for which I'm made. And so grace works like with my will like this and brings it to a completion and a perfection, where without it, if I'm left to my own devices without grace, I have a tendency to deviate from what God intends and introduce evil and chaos into the world.
One thing I've heard as well is that free will is an essential ingredient for love. And if God just made us to be robots or slaves, or the concept of loving God and being an instrument of God's love would be pretty foreign to us.
Right.
So that's something I thought was very powerful.
Right.
We go back to God the Father, right? There's a relationship.
I think so. If you think about it in the way that we're constituted, our intellectual being, God made us both intelligent and free. Our intelligence is made to be perfected in the truth, and since he is the highest truth, the highest perfection we can achieve is knowledge of God. Well, our freedom finds its perfection in the good. And the good is what is desirable. This is that whole idea of love there. And since God is eminently good, he's eminently desirable. But nobody is forced to the good, right? The good is something that is freely chosen for because of its desirability and because we love it. and not because I was thinking about this today. When I was growing up, I hated potatoes, and I would not eat them. You can't force me to eat the potatoes. I don't like them, I would tell my mom. But you've never tried them. How do you know? You can only love what you know. Right?
Yeah.
So she was just trying to get me to, try the potatoes so that then I could say I didn't like them. But that's the way with God. We can only love what we know. And if he doesn't reveal himself and make himself known, the truth, then our wills to choose the beauty of his good are not going to be free to do that because we won't know him. And so there's this great line where Jesus says that you shall know the truth and the truth shall make you free. And it's precisely in this whole dynamic where God makes himself known so as to be loved, and he can only be loved by a free creature.
And there's seems to me, a certain moral calculus that goes on in that, to build virtue without the possibility of not being virtuous, without the possibility of being, sinful, would be almost impossible as well. Right? So if we are trying to be reflecting God's image, built and made in God's image, as good, and practicing that through virtue, it's we wouldn't almost know what that meant without the possibility of having the freedom to not be that way.
Right. But at the same time, you're not asking, is it do I have to experience evil in order to appreciate good? You're not asking that question, are you?
No.
Oh.
that was Adam and Eve.
No, I know that. But I think that with regard to the whole idea of virtue, it's not so much that we have the possibility to be vicious, that is full of vice, but we're made to be virtuous, and our freedom is truly free when we're virtuous. I like to express it in this way, because my students think that omnipotence means the ability to do whatever you want. But if you look at that with regard to human beings, if we have the ability to do whatever we want, then what we want is focused with laser beam on intensity on one desire. And that desire could be, say, alcoholic beverage. I want to do what I want to drink beer, so that as my desire focuses on that one thing, I become imprisoned in the behaviors that ultimately bind me in that desire for drink. I'm not truly free. I'm doing whatever I want, but I'm not truly free. Well, God, he breaks into that prison, and he opens it up and frees us from that. And if you perceive like a funnel moving from the narrow end to the broader end towards God, the more I live towards God in virtue, it's not the less free that I become, it's the more free that I become. And so freedom then, and power, both with God and with human beings, is to live fully in accord with one's nature. You see, well, God can't go contrary to his nature, so he's truly free. We can go contrary to our nature, so we're not truly free in that sense.
I guess I want to kind of explore an arena in that, we seem to like to challenge God's omnipotence, and it's in the arena of life, of creating life or not creating life. We have people, like in vitro fertilization, and now we're getting to where people are considering 3-parent fetuses. I'm not sure how that works, but the whole genetic engineering thing, we get to the point where we understand nature, and then we think that we can then supplant nature, and then the concept of humans being and flesh souls, and saying, well, okay, now if God would will that people be brought about through natural means, then when we create this person in a petri dish, are we forcing him to create a soul to honor our desires? Right. How do we handle that kind of concept, or
Boy, you just threw a whole can of worms at me, Alan.
I'm sorry.
So let me see if I can unpack this a little bit, and we'll see where it goes.
All right.
So the first thing is that to the degree that we human beings have increasingly focused on the world as nature versus the world as creation, means that, and this is Cardinal Ratzinger says this in his sermons on original sin and creation, called In the Beginning. If you ever have a chance to read that, it's really good. But he talks about the way that the Enlightenment and subsequently modernity increasingly focuses on nature and our power to manipulate it as we will. So when we no longer look at the world as a created being of God, then we push God out of the limelight, and we focus more and more on our own godlike powers to be able to manipulate the world as we see it, with the tragedies of what you spoke about here with three-parent embryos or however. I've not heard of that, but I'm not surprised by it. You know what I mean? So you have this sense that human beings, through their technical know-how, have the superior ability that make them essentially gods. Well, this is pride, and it's hubris, and it's destructive. And if people can't see that now, then they will see it as it's more and more put into operation. Of course, we know this, the depredations of the environment over the course of the last 300 years through our technological manipulation of the world and other things is a sign that maybe we can't live quite up to the divine status. So that's one aspect of the answer. Now, the other one is that when we fertilize eggs in a petri dish, are we forcing God to bring those souls into being, and so on and so forth? No, I don't think we're forcing God at all. I think that the Catholic doctrine is that at the moment of conception, God infuses into that being freely an individual soul, and that infusing of the soul can happen within the womb as well as outside of the womb, because it's the moment of conception in which the human being is created. Now, what's unfortunate about this whole process is that it's separated from the unitive dimension of procreation, and it gives the scientists the ability to then harvest these human beings, right? It's not so much that God is being forced to make human beings. We should be focusing on who do we think we are to harvest human beings as if they were things, and then enslave them by cryovacuuming them and then selling them to the highest bidder of whoever that may be.
Right.
This is dehumanizing, actually. It's not God bestowing life on these beings that is dehumanizing.
Yeah, literally.
It's us that are dehumanizing these other creatures, and that's sad. It's a great tragedy.
So let's talk a little bit about how the understanding of God's omnipotence has kind of evolved in Catholic thought. Obviously, from the Bible, where God is seen as all powerful, as Job kind of is having his troubles and kind of pouring out. God says, well, where were you there when I built this place, and that kind of thing.
Right.
And so even from the earliest times, that sense has been there. And again, as we've kind of pointed out, the world of modernity has kind of slowly eroded that, and some would kind of say that we're whittling away at superstition, ignorance, that kind of thing. How would the Catholic thinkers see God's omnipotence as they have become, they're learning more about the world?
Right. I think one of the most original understandings of God as omnipotent is in the whole idea of the Pantocrator. When you see that Christ, that God is reigning over all of creation and providentially establishing it in according to his intention. This is really what omnipotence is. It's God being able to bring into being the world out of nothing, and then to govern it in his wonderful providence to its fulfillment in the beatific vision. And so in that particular sense, then, there's no aspect of our lives in which God's power is absent, and that there's no dimension of our lives in which we are not being guided gently by God's will for the perfection that we were meant for. And so this then, because with this Pantocrator, this all-powerful providential power that creates out of his goodness and brings everything to fulfillment in his goodness, this is a quite positive view of the world. We have a tendency to view God's omnipotence quite negatively, as if it's this will to power that is just wants to crush and kill and destroy. Well, I think that's a result of our modern world trying to see God in our own image and likeness, because that's the way we stride across the natural world and trash it and manipulate it and twist it in ways that we think our science is best suited for it.
Right.
So.
It's interesting that you point out that we tend to actually see God through our own lenses and our own self-reflection, as it were, and sometimes that makes him smaller than he is and less awesome when you think about it.
Right. Oh yeah, I think so. And another thing is I think that we need to take more seriously, I mean, everybody says this, the economy of salvation. This is the economy of salvation, the order of salvation. It's like God's household. He governs it. And then if we look at the economies of our own households, right, we govern that to achieve the ultimate good of the family and the members of the family and the children and so on and so forth. You see what I'm saying? But it gets more difficult for us to see such things, I think, because, well, the family's fallen apart, and we've got all this kind of disorder surrounding us, and the good symbols that should shine through and show us what God's omnipotence is really like have become so obscured or distorted that we don't understand as earlier ages perhaps did. And we've got to recover that.
Yeah. And that reminds me, I was thinking the other day about the fact that many people consider, when they look at Catholicism or religion in general, as being kind of a downer and a oppressive kind of force, that they forget all the beauty that we really focus on, that about God and what He is doing, and what it means to have family and love, and that richness of the relationship that is centered in the life with God. And an understanding and appreciation of who He is. And so it's kind of tragic.
It is.
As you look around and say, you're missing out on so much. And then I think that those of us who have kind of lived through that, the 60s, 70s, the sexual revolution, the me generation, and all this kind of stuff, we kind of look back and, nostalgically and say, how do we get that back? How do we get that, that center back? I don't know, we'll just keep praying and working as best we can to remind people what beauty there is there. Right. And that when we talk about God's omnipotence, He wants so much more for us.
He does. And again, that the whole idea that Catholicism is oppressive, for example, only comes from the moral standpoint that there are rules, so-called rules, that we need to follow. But that comes from the attitude that my freedom, I can do whatever I want. Yep. And that's not freedom, that's slavery to sin. That's what the Church teaches, and that's what Christ frees us from.
Right, absolutely. So I want to thank you for being with us again. It's always a pleasure. We hope you come back again soon. And we hope you come back again soon. We thank you for being with us today. And we hope that our conversation has been somewhat illuminating, challenging, interesting. And we hope you'll visit us again soon. And in the meantime, we'll keep praying for you in the name of the Father, the Son, and the Holy Spirit. Amen.